Welcome everyone to another amazing episode of the Average Ontario Anglers Fishing Podcast. Today we have, as always with us, our special co-host, Andrew, the man with the mustache and the beard. How you doing, man?
Good. My mom says I'm special too.
Yeah, I wouldn't believe that. I'm your host, Jesse. Today we actually have a really cool episode. Now, bass season is coming up really fast, and pike season, musky season, and a bunch of whole other of the seasons are open. I think the only one we're waiting on right now is bass season in Ontario.
I think so too.
In Southern Ontario. The zone we fish anyway, all those guys up in the north are like, it never closes, or it's been open since May. Lucky. But anyway, we have a really cool episode today about spinnerbaits. Now, last year on the podcast, we actually went through a bunch of our favorite baits. We did specific episodes on chatterbaits and other baits like that. So if you want to check those out, definitely look back to last year. I'll put some of them in the show notes about different lures. But this one is going to be all about spinnerbaits because we've never done that before. And it's a lure that is amazing. But before we get into the main topic, we have, for the first time in season 2, we have a TNT. And what does TNT stand for?
Techniques and tips.
So Andrew has one. So dazzle us with a new TNT.
Well, I wanted to talk about something that I'm super excited about using again for bass season. It's one of my preferred ways to catch bass. You know, frog is amazing. I love frogs. But something else that I really like to use is weightless plastics. Now, whenever we think of a weightless plastic, I'm sure everyone thinks of the stick bait.
Yep.
It's an amazing weightless plastic. You wacky rig it, or you can Texas rig these and they slide to the weeds way better, and they still have a great quiver as they fall down. So that's a nice weedless presentation. And for me, I love to fish weightless plastics, flipping around weeds, around docks, around timber. It just excels. Now, one of the things that we also like to do is we'll rig frog imitators with just a weightless hook. So again, you can Texas rig a frog. This here is the Wamphibian, but you can use any frog imitator plastic pretty much. And with this, even just a single EWG hook, like a number 3 or number 4/0 for most of the plastics, you can rig them weedless, like a Texas rig style, and just cast it out and you just slowly reel it in. So even if it's not a floating plastic, they'll still come along the surface of the water. A lot of the plastics out there, like Z-Man, like the Goat Toad, something like that, even some other brands, they have floating plastic, and they will actually support the weight of a more of a finesse, like a thinner wire hook. So I have number 3, like 3/0 EWG hooks, extra wide gap, offset hooks, and they will stay buoyant with just a regular Z-Man goat, not even the Goat Toad, just a goat or something like that. Even some of Wes's baits at Wham Baits, again, buoyant again. So they'll support thinner wire hooks. That's just an example. And I just wanted to show you my favorite is a fluke. Now this is an oversized fluke, which yes, I do fish it and I love it, but I just thought it would show up a little bit easier on camera to kind of see how I like to rig it. So this is a number 8 beast hook that I'm going to rig it on. Now I find with the weedless flukes, what I like to do a lot of the time when you think of something Texas rigged, the eye of the hook is still shown at the top of the bait. And yes, your hook point is still in there, but if you look at a bait like this, even though this is an 8/0 hook, this is a 7-inch bait. Oh, I'm going to stab my toe with that hook there. So this is a 7-inch bait, and there's a lot of bait that's left behind. And what I find with the flukes, when I fish them weedless, and my biggest largemouth so far has come on a weedless fluke, or a weightless fluke. And I find it retrieves through weeds way better than a weedless frog or anything else. It is probably the most weedless topwater lure I have ever used. You know, you see a lot of guys when they're strolling their jigs and stuff like that, or doing hover rigs, and they're just twitching their rod tip as they're reeling in. You fish that the same way. I've done that for years on flukes. And as you quiver your rod tip, it's just shaking the head of that bait, and it comes through all the weed stems awesomely. So going back to rigging it here, I notice with the flukes, they tend not to blow up on these oftentimes like a frog. You know, whether or not it's because it's imitating a fish, I'm not sure, but it's imitating a bait fish, and these bass, they'll come up underneath and they'll just kind of slurp it off the surface. Highly effective, and I'll just wait. You'll see your line start to track sideways. Then you set the hook. Let them kind of readjust it in their mouth. But they oftentimes don't just explode on these. So I don't want the hook being all the way at the front of the bait and they just come up and kind of slurp at the back, and then I'm going to miss that fish because that hook is not even in their mouth. So what I'll often do is when I come into the nose, I'll come back a full inch into the bait before I bring it down. And then when I have my line tie, even a snap, some of these, Cyberflex plastics and whatnot, they're stretchy enough that you can actually hide the snap completely in the bait if you really don't want to be tying on a hook. But really, if it breaks off you, just a hook is better anyways. So you have your hook in the front, and now that's fully into the bait. And now your hook is now midway. The hook point is midway in that bait. So it can, you got to play it by ear depending on your baits. It can create it more rigid plastic, but at the same time, I'm not looking for this. It's not like it's a paddle tail or anything like that. So this thing, as it comes through the water, it's just going to have a nice little kicking tail action as you twitch it. And you can actually walk the dog with these things. They'll start darting around underwater. They'll kind of dip down and roll a bit, and you let it sit and they'll come up to the top. Now this is a big fluke, but oftentimes I'll use a 3-inch fluke or 3.5-inch fluke on a number 2 or number 3. A number 2 finesse hook floats with most baits. So that's something that I wanted to talk about there. That is something that I often have great success with. It's not a new trick. I didn't make it up, but it is something that I've been doing for a long time. And it's not something I really see done a whole lot. It's not as popular as fishing a hollow body frog, but I find especially on those days when you need a finesse bite, it produces better than a frog. But that's my little technique to try there for you. And yeah, weightless plastics, but especially fishing a weightless fluke. Even if you have a little bit more weight, you can fish it right around docks and just let it slowly sink. And that slow sink right around there, give it a twitch and it'll dart underneath that dock even. That's what I like to do. I'm excited again for the warmer weather for bass season. And this is going to be one of my mainstays that I have tied on.
Definitely. And I've seen you clean up on that. So that's definitely, like you said, it's a technique that it's not new. It's been around for decades, but underutilized in our area for sure. Or if people are doing it, they're just not talking about it. And there's a good reason for that because it kills. It's a weapon on the water. So thanks for that TNT. It wasn't as explosive as I thought it was going to be. I thought the TNT was going to be like, here's how to use dynamite to catch fish.
Well, next week is about how to use live squirrels to catch musky. That's illegal. Don't do it.
So this week's episode, like we mentioned, it is all about fishing spinnerbaits. And we're going to kind of focus on 3 main species of fish. Spinnerbaits catch everything, as we're going to get into, but we're going to be talking about bass because bass season is coming up. And we're going to be talking about musky and pike. Now, again, you can get spinnerbaits in all different sizes and catch anything from bluegills to probably blue whales if you wanted to.
Yes, the krill spinnerbait, very popular in the ocean fishing.
Yeah. Just make sure you have a full 4,000 size spool so you don't get spooled. So we're going to talk about spinnerbaits. And now, like, if you're listening to this podcast and you're obsessed with fishing, you know what a spinnerbait is. We don't have to tell you, but just in case you're a beginner and you're getting into it, we're going to describe a spinnerbait for you. Why don't you do that, Andrew?
So picture a jig. Like most of the baits you talk about, picture a jig. And then it has a long metal arm that comes out from the front of it. And that arm makes a 90-degree turn and comes back above that bait. So you have a big skirted jig, just like that. Like I said, you have that arm coming in front with a line tie and all these blades in the back. And as the name denotes, it's a spinnerbait. So as it comes through the water, the whole thing will rotate around. No, I'm just kidding. Just the blades will start to spin on that top arm. And because it's bottom weighted with that jig, it'll run nice and straight and true. And because there's only a single hook that's directly in line with that arm, it's very weedless as well.
It's simple, like you said. It's a jig with an arm with a bunch of blades on it. Now, there's tons of baits, like you said, similar to that. So the bait that often I find gets put in with spinnerbaits is chatterbaits because they're very similar if you think about it, but at the same time, they're very different. A lot of people have messaged us last year on the podcast about chatterbaits or about just generally on our Instagram. They'll say, what's better, chatterbait or a spinnerbait? And they're different baits for different situations, although there's a lot of overlap in the middle. Like I know for a long time, I love fishing spinnerbaits. It's one of my favorite lures for pike, for bass, for everything. And then when we started fishing chatterbaits, we kind of just only fished chatterbaits and the spinnerbaits just kind of got dust on them in our tackle boxes. But I find that that's kind of switching right now for me. Chatterbaits have been slaying fish for more than a decade now, but I'm slowly switching back to spinnerbaits because I forgot that they're good at other things that chatterbaits aren't. So we're going to kind of get into that. We're not going to talk about chatterbaits. Again, there's a whole episode we did all about chatterbaits. It's called Chattering About Chatterbaits, and I'll link that below in the show notes. But a chatterbait, as you know, it's a jig just like a spinnerbait, but it has a blade attached directly to the head. With the spinnerbait, it has that arm. Now that arm is very important because, like Andrew said, it makes the bait a lot more weedless. A lot more weedless than a chatterbait, that's for sure. Now, we're going to talk about why spinnerbaits work so well. So I'm going to say one reason, and then we're going to go to Andrew, and he's going to say one reason. And these are our personal opinions. This is why spinnerbait works so well. For me, it's a search bait. It's one of the first search baits that comes into my head because it's a bait that, you can fish it around cover and make short casts and fish it accurately. But for me, a lot of times when I'm fishing a spinnerbait, I'm just whipping it as far as I can and I'm covering water. I'm trying to find fish. And everything about a spinnerbait to me is all about attracting fish. So you have this bait that you can cast decently far, but it's got a lot of flash and vibration that will attract fish from a long distance away, as compared to some other baits that maybe don't have as much. Say a crankbait. Crankbait, that's a great search bait. It has a lot of vibration in the water, maybe some noise from the rattles, but it has no flash, very little flash. A spinnerbait has flash and vibration. So especially in clear water, it's one of those baits that it attracts fish like a jerk bait from far away. So especially for bass fishing and pike fishing, fish that are attracted to flash, it's a huge, huge player when you're not aware of where the fish exactly are and you have to cover a lot of water. A spinnerbait is one of those baits that is going to be one of the first things I grab and just start casting as far as I can, just covering water. That's why a spinnerbait for me is an effective lure. What about you?
For me, I have to say it's again, on top of all those reasons, because I agree with them wholeheartedly. A spinnerbait we use versatility a lot, but spinnerbaits, one, you can get different weights. So yes, they can run different depths just by how heavy they are and how many blades, the different style of blades create different lift, different vibrations, different flash. But on top of that, if you have one spinnerbait, let's just take a standard spinnerbait here that has 2 willow leaf blades. I think this is a 1/2 ounce head on it, and you can put a variety of trailers on it. We're going to go into all that stuff, but you can put a variety of different trailers on it. You can get again, we're not changing the colors, but you can get different colors. You can rip this fast, you can reel it slow. And because of that, you can fish this effectively at a variety of different depths. So instead of having to swap between baits, you can just start reeling in slower, goes deeper, reeling in faster, comes shallower. And because they're weedless, you can really use that to your advantage. So spinnerbaits can be hard to put action to them. Like, it's not like a jerk bait. You can kind of twitch them in and whatnot. Absolutely. Again, we're going to get into some stuff, but you can use these around cover and structure. So you can start bumping these against everything. And as soon as they start bumping against things, that creates action. So it comes along and it starts ticking weeds, through rice stands or through timber. And it's bumping it. All of a sudden, the blades stop that spinning or vibration for that 1/2 second. And it's oftentimes right after it comes in contact with something else that can be what triggers the strike. So they're really useful. You can fish it in open water or around structure. So it's at variety of depths. So it's one of those things where if you have a limited amount of rods and you are searching for fish, like Jesse said, using it as a search bait, it becomes very effective at covering a lot of the water column and a lot of different, cover that you're fishing.
Definitely. So the next point we're going to kind of cover, you kind of went into this, is like why you need a spinnerbait. And again, if you're an avid angler, you probably already have many spinnerbaits, but maybe it's something that you haven't fished for a long time, or you've just like us, we went on to chatterbaits and we're like, you know what, maybe it's time to start, looking back at the old spinnerbait because it's a great lure. So why you need a spinnerbait? Like Andrew said, I think the main thing for me compared to other baits is the weedlessness of a spinnerbait. Is that a word? Weedlessness? It is now. So the weedlessness of a spinnerbait, because of that R-bend arm, it deflects a lot of weeds, timber, dock posts, anything like that. You can pretty much cast a spinnerbait not into the thick slop or stuff like that, but you can cast it through lily pads. I've had days where I'm pike fishing or bass fishing and I'll cast a spinnerbait as I'm working down the bank, and then there's a big group of lily pads, and I'll cast it right behind the lily pads, reel it on top of the lily pads, let it fall down the hole, and then reel it out, and it doesn't snag on anything. And sometimes a bass just grabs it, right? So maybe not ideal for that, but it does come through a lot of stuff. Like you said, reeds, timber, weeds, rocks. That arm deflects a lot of stuff. Not to say that it's completely weedless, because nothing is completely weedless, as you would know if you cast into slop. Unless you're fishing a hollow body frog on top of the water, it's coming back with something on it. So it's as weedless as it can get for a search bait.
Yeah, and especially with harder things that it's going against, like you said, like reeds, bulrushes, or timber, or docks or whatnot, because that arm, like I said, is sitting right above that hook. if it's coming at something and it's hitting it, nothing's going to hit that. Like, unless you're getting right over the top of something, anything that's long and hard, you're not going to snag on it as it's rubbing along it, because that arm and those blades are directly above that hook. So anything that is more rigid and stiff, you're pretty much guaranteed not to snag into it, unless like the end of that stick happens to fall between the two arms. Like, okay, then maybe nothing's 100%, but this is as close as you can get to an exposed hook that is weedless still somehow.
Yeah, no, they're fantastic. And we're going to kind of get into what eats spinnerbait. So like I said, we're going to talk today about bass, pike, and musky, the main fish that I'm going to fish a spinnerbait for. But spinnerbaits, like we mentioned, they come in all different sizes. If you ever go to your tackle store or you're looking online, you'll see spinnerbaits start at little tiny 1/8 ounce little mini bushwhacker spinnerbaits for crappie, all the way up to huge musky spinnerbaits, which are giant. Very effective in all sizes. They catch everything from panfish, bass, smallmouth bass, especially largemouth bass, musky, pike. Any predatory fish is going to attack a spinnerbait. In fact, when it comes to walleye, I caught my PB 29-inch walleye on a spinnerbait when I was pike fishing. And a lot of people are like, oh, you caught it on a spinnerbait? That's weird. I'm like, why is that weird? It's basically an imitation of some kind of, say, like a minnow or a baitfish or something. And big walleye eat huge things. So it's not really weird at all. In fact, I've caught many walleye on spinnerbaits when fishing around the weeds. It basically is a lure that gets down to where it needs to be, and whatever fish happens to be there, it's going to grab it. They're effective lures. We're going to talk about bass, pike, and musky, like we said. But first, we're going to say, where are we going to fish spinnerbaits? Now, we kind of covered this. Now, let's go through the species. Maybe we'll talk about 1 or 2 situations where a spinnerbait is one of the first things we're going to grab. So why don't you take bass, Andrew? Smallmouth bass.
Smallmouth bass. I have to say that my favorite place, and it's because it's so like traditional, it's what I saw guys doing in the old magazines back in the day, is like a rocky flat, about, maybe 4 to 6 feet of water or whatever, with just that spikeweed or rice, whatever you want to call it, that thin grass-like hard reed that grows through and is kind of like sparse. That is the perfect stuff to throw a spinnerbait through. Because you'll just you'll long bomb a cast, the line will fall in between all the reeds, however it lays, doesn't matter. And you just start reeling it in, and it just is deflecting around all these reeds as it comes around with that line, and you're not going to snag up on any of them. And you can even, reel it nice and slow, and it's hitting off the rocks in the bottom as you go. And smallmouth, again, it's a lot of flash. It's usually like fishing around reeds like that. You're going to be in shallow water. And so the visibility is most likely going to be higher, close to the surface. Even if it's stained water, you're going to have some sunlight reflecting. And so that really helps for these fish who are just kind of cruising around or not really holding in some dense weeds waiting to ambush. They're cruising around. So it's going to help them to really zero in on it. So that, for me, whenever I think of fishing a spinnerbait, that's like the epitome of my ideal location to fish a spinnerbait for smallmouth bass.
Yeah, I love that. We actually had an experience last year. We were fishing this lake. We were searching an area of the lake that we hadn't been to before. And I had a spinner. Last year, I was on the spinnerbait game last year. And I had a white spinnerbait with a white trailer. And we found this beautiful, like this big rocky flat with all these, the rice coming up. And Andrew's like, oh, this place looks amazing. He's tying on a spinnerbait. And I already had one tied on, so I whipped it out. First cast, I was like, here's a smallmouth. Boom. First cast, I caught a nice smallmouth. Yeah. Release the fish. Cast again. Boom. Muskie bit me off. So those areas, they hold a lot of fish at certain times of the day. They come out there and feed, obviously. But a spinnerbait's a great way because it was a fairly expansive flat with lots of reeds. If you were going to sit there and slowly pick it apart, that may be a good technique. But if you are literally searching for fish, a spinnerbait is probably one of the best tools to cover water quickly and find where those fish are. And smallmouth, they're so aggressive. Yeah. They love chasing. So a spinnerbait's perfect.
And again, if it's like that lake we were fishing, the water was quite clear, long visibility. And so if you get it close to these fish, if you're trying to fish something with treble hooks, or you're trying to fish a lighter, slower presentation, perhaps, like a weedless or a weightless, Sanko or something like that, you're not casting as far oftentimes, or you can't cast so far because you're going to get snagged and hung up. So the spinnerbait, you could long bomb it as normal through this stuff. Like, take a bit of time to maybe cast into like some of the lanes if you see them when they're open. It's great. But you can long bomb it right into these things, the spinnerbait. And I can't think of a single other bait that you'd be able to do that besides maybe a weedless fluke. But you're going to be fishing that way slower. So if your idea is to cover water, the spinnerbait is the best thing. A chatterbait will get hung up and that blade will catch and kink that reed and it folds over and it won't come through smoothly. I love chatterbaits, but for that scenario specifically, you cannot beat a spinnerbait.
Yes, I agree. Because like some chatterbaits have weed guards on them, but like you said, it's not necessarily the hook, it's the blade too. Because the blade is just like a shovel head spinning back and or wobbling back and forth, catching every reed in its path. Not what you want. You talked about smallmouth. Largemouth for me, one of my favorite ways to catch largemouth is around like deep timber. You know, you're going along the shoreline, you see like a big full out tree that fell in the water and it goes way down. Like you see the trunk right on shore and it goes down, you see all the branches going out. There's a few lakes that we fish that are just full of timber. And there's many ways you can catch them. One of my favorite ways is with a spinnerbait, because like we mentioned, that R bend, the arm, it deflects branches pretty good. You will get hung up from time to time. No lure is completely treeless, but a spinnerbait is great on that. And the cool thing is a lot of these trees that fall in, sometimes they fall in on like really steep drop-offs. So the trunk of the tree is in like 2 feet of water, but the tree itself may go down 20 feet, even more. And these bass, sometimes they suspend, so they won't always be at the bottom. We always, make a few casts up by the stump by the shore, but some of these bass may be suspended 20 feet, down over 30 feet of water. They could be 10 feet under. So you never know. So a cool technique with a spinnerbait is you can whip it out along the shoreline, let it come towards you and then let it flutter down, like helicopter down, and then keep reeling. And you can basically count down and cover different depths and find where those fish are actually suspending. So I absolutely love that. The coolest thing ever is when you cast a spinnerbait out and then you let it helicopter down and you just feel like a slight tap and you reel in the slack and there's a 3 or 4 pound bass on there and like a largemouth just comes up and engulfs that spinnerbait and then heads back down to where he was hanging out under the tree. And your line just tightens up and you feel that tap. Then you set the hook and all heck breaks loose. That's fantastic. I love it. And again, there's a lot of lures you could use in that situation, but I feel like for helicoptering, a spinnerbait, just the helicoptering technique, which we're going to get into a bit, it's very, very effective. And there's few other lures that do something similar while being weedless and branchless at the same time.
Mm-hmm. A lot of guys fish timber with a jig, and it's great. Like flip a jig in there. That's awesome. Also effective. But when you have the spinnerbait, like we said, it's essentially a lead-headed jig with a big arm on the front of it. You can fish them like a jig. You can let it, like I said, helicopter down. It's just a vertical presentation. You can hop it around. And then when you start to retrieve, especially, cast to the base of the tree, work to the front, or else you're going to be caught up in those, all the forks and stuff like that in the branches. But, work with the branches of the tree. But yeah, you can fish that and pull it right up back through that whole timber because it is a big metal weed guard in the front of it, just like your flipping jig. It's just a little bit higher up on that hook.
So one of our favorite fish to fish for is pike, northern pike. Everyone loves, well, not everyone.
They love them or they love to hate them.
Yep. One of my favorite, and I'm sure one of Andrew's favorite lures for pike is a spinnerbait. Even when we fished the cottage back when we were kids, we went through phases of using different lures, but there was 1 or 2 summers in a row, I think, that we were absolutely slamming pike and bass and everything that hit on a spinnerbait. And it was one of those lures that we just loved, and we would troll it and we would cast it and we would do everything with it, and it always caught us fish. It's just a super effective lure for pike. It's great because I know we got into this a bit on our pike episode. The less hooks on a pike lure, the better I like it. So like jerkbait with 3 treble hooks, fantastic pike lure, terrible to get out of their mouth. Very bad. If you're keeping them, not a big deal, obviously, but if you're trying to do catch and release, a spinnerbait where you can get away with it, that one single hook, or even a chatterbait, that's what you want. They grab it, they're hooked good, you get them in the net, and it pops out pretty quick. You don't have to worry about it. That's one plus of using a spinnerbait for pike. But like we mentioned, pike are ambush predators, right? So they're oftentimes around timber, in weeds, around big rocks, around areas where you're going to get snagged. So one of the best lures is spinnerbait because it's weedless, has that R bend to deflect off everything. And another reason, I know he knows all about this because he's a pike expert, but pike love flash. They're visual feeders. So why would you say a spinnerbait is like one of the best lures for pike?
It's because the flash is going to attract them. Again, pike, they're looking visually. They need sight to ambush their predators, to ambush their prey, sorry. So for them, the visual component is huge. Yes, they also deal with vibration, but they're very visual when they're hunting. Unlike largemouth bass, they have their lateral line. That's their primary, is their lateral line oftentimes. Catfish, it's their scent. Pike, it's the vision. So when you have something that can gear your presentation towards that species of fish, that's ideal. And I'm just going to go into another reason why trolling, like Jesse said, we used to troll them at the cottage. And the reason why the spinnerbait is fantastic for trolling is if you have, things coming down your line, they're not going to get caught up on a bill or anything like that. It's going to hit that frame, kind of glide off. If your bait, you're running, going over some logs and a tree comes out at the cottage, happen all the time, new trees would fall in, you don't know it's there, and we're snagging up. And the spinnerbait would kind of come along and just kind of roll up over that log and keep going. So it was great. And if it does get fouled up, you can feel the spinning of the blades have stopped. So it's pretty rare when you reel it in and, there's a bit of weed stuck on the hook. It did happen, but it was far less common to have that. So we knew that we could be pretty confident when our bait was out there. We weren't constantly reeling in because we felt something touch it again. Like, I got to reel in. I ticked a weed and now I'm just dragging weeds again. So it is a good effective lure for trolling especially. And again, if you're on those weed lines or around those timber, the pike are all going to be in there. And it killed, and it still does to this day.
Yeah, it's a great trolling lure. And I thought, because we're talking about pike, I'll tell you a little story. I was trolling for musky this is a Blackfly Lures pike and musky taker. This is the big boy. It's a musky size spinnerbait. I have a bunch of these. They're fantastic. But this color particularly, I was talking to Dean at Blackfly Lures at one of the fishing shows, and he's like, where do you fish? And I was like, I fish Kawarthas a lot. He's like, you need this purple. And I forget the color name, but it's black, silicone, and then silver, and then purple, and the head's purple. And it's a color that, I don't know, I always like purple, but I wouldn't have given this color a second look. But he's like, no, it's great for the Kawarthas. So you know me, I bought it. So I was trolling this, and like you said, I love trolling spinnerbaits because if you're trolling a crankbait and you're fishing, along a weed line, every so often there's going to be a weed that comes out, and then you snag, and sometimes you don't notice for a while, and then you reel in and there's all these weeds on your hook, and you're like, how long was my bait dragging these weeds, wasting my time, right? No fish is going to come up and grab a bait covered in weeds, right? So spinnerbait is great because most of the time you can just let it, you see your rod tip just thumping behind the boat, and you can tell when there's something on your bait because the vibration will stop or it'll be weird. So it's weedless. So I was fishing this behind the boat along a weed line, fishing for musky. I just watching my rod. I was sitting there, like that time of day when it's lunchtime and it's bright sun and you're like, I don't really feel like bite is the best of all time right now. So I usually troll and eat my lunch at that time. So I'm trolling up this river right along this nice deep weed line. And my rod just goes like wiggle, 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 whoom, just bent over and just thump, 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 just coming down. And I was like, I thought I hooked like a huge musky. So I'm fighting this fish. I'm bringing it in and I scoop it in the net, and it wasn't a musky. It was a huge pike. I'd say my biggest Kawartha pike. It was pretty big. I wasn't even mad. Like I was musky fishing, but this big pike, I was like, I'll take it. I don't care. I'm not one of those snob guys, but this huge pike just came up and absolutely just engulfed this thing. This is a big bait. It had it fully in its mouth and only the blade was hanging out of its mouth. I was like, wow, he literally inhaled that. But guess what? The hook came out easy. Got a few pictures of the fish, and they swam way fine. So they are very effective trolling baits for pike and musky. Again, I was trolling for musky. It's one of my favorite baits to troll for musky. So why don't we talk about musky quick? Musky season just opened.
I caught my second biggest musky on one of the Blackfly Lures, Fat Bastards. And that was my second biggest musky.
I have some of those right now. We're going to talk more about these later. But if you're watching this on the video podcast, this is one of my original Blackfly Lures Big Bastards, and it's completely shredded. All the tinsel on this is almost falling apart and the head's like chotched, but it's caught its fair share of fish. For musky fishing this time of year, again, we did a whole episode about early season musky tips, so I'll link that below too. But spinnerbaits are fantastic because oftentimes musky are very shallow, right, Andrew? Like early season, where are we fishing?
We are fishing where the bass boats can't go. No.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sometimes
shallow.
we are.
Yeah, sometimes we're fishing. I don't think this time of year, you can go too shallow. I've seen musky in 1.5 feet of water. Again, musky can be anywhere. They're unpredictable fish, but usually early season, they're still relating to shallowish structure. So we are generally in 8 feet or less. So where we fish anyway, Depends on what lake you do, but where we fish, it's generally pretty weedy. So a spinnerbait, again, like we said, they're weedless. They're great baits. You can fish them around weed beds, around weed lines, around lily pads. And that's where some of these muskie are chilling after they spawned, and they love the spinnerbaits. And like Andrew said, his second biggest muskie ever, that was a good fish. It was caught on a Blackfly Lures Big Bastard, which is a very cool lure because it's kind of that middle ground between a musky sized bait and a bass bait.
Right before that muskie, I caught a big bass.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I use these for bass fishing too. It's actually one of my favorite pike lures, but it's not a huge musky spinnerbait, which may seem intimidating because you actually need pretty heavy gear to cast one of these because it's got big, thick hooks. It's a big, heavy bait. You can cast a big bastard on bass tackle, no problem if you're fishing for bass, or you can fish it on light musky tackle. But it's cool because it's a 3/4 ounce bait, so it's not even 1 ounce. It's 3/4 ounce. It's very, very fishable, but it's big enough. It's got a big enough profile, especially if you put a twister on it, that it is big enough to attract a big pike or a big muskie, especially early in the season. So that's a fantastic lure. We kind of covered like all these different fish. They love spinner baits and they're just effective lures. But before we get into the next point, I thought we could talk about our giveaway this week. We have an awesome giveaway, and our giveaway sponsor for this episode is actually, you guessed it, I'm going to give you 1 second to guess. You're right. It's Blackfly Lures. So Dean from Blackfly Lures, probably one of the nicest guys ever. Every time we go to a
big
trade
friendly
show,
giant.
he's always like, hey, you weirdos. But his family's been making spinnerbaits for decades, and he has donated a very cool giveaway. And we're going to just talk about some of our favorite. We kind of went in a little bit to some of these spinnerbaits, but we're going to go through some of our favorites. So if you do win this giveaway, which is a promo code for his website, you can order some of these. And I'm going to show you my overall number one favorite Blackfly Lure spinnerbait. And you guessed it, it's a big bastard. But this particular color combo is my absolute favorite. So it's a black with a black and orange head. I think he has black head, black body too. What I do is I thread on a 5 or 6 inch twister tail grub, and I point the twister facing down. That's a tip, because if you face it pointing up, you may think that's the way it's supposed to go. You'll actually snag the twister on your hook all the time. So face it down. It has just a little action. The thing is with this is it is a smaller bait. It's got a smaller profile, but it has big blades on it. So when you chuck that thing out for muskie early season, those blades are just thumping. Like I'm sure that fish can feel that 20, 30 feet away. It's just thumping. There's lots of flash coming from it, but the same size, it's not intimidating. It's just a small bait. You could catch a 12-inch bass on that. You could catch a 20-pound muskie. It's just a great, great bait. In fact, this one is one of my favorites, but one of my other favorites, he has all kinds of like fire tiger colors. These are absolutely fantastic for northern pike. This one is especially cool. It's the fire tiger one, but black fire tiger. I don't have the other one here with me right now, but a white big bastard is one of the best pike spinner baits probably that you can get.
Yeah, I got a couple different ones myself.
So do you have one of your favorites over there, Andrew?
4-bladed one. Yeah, and they're hammered steel on this. I love I'm a sucker for hammered steel on my spoons and spinner baits and stuff like that. This is the white and chartreuse with gold blades. It's great for like an overcast day. And this thing here, I like it because if you were to put this many blades of like the Colorado style, where they're like the round blades, they're going to have tons of lift. These provide a fair bit of lift too, so I like fishing these again. Like this is the one I love fishing around reeds and stuff like that. Tons of flash. You can fish it effectively at a bunch of different depths. But that's what I really like fishing around rice and reeds. And then something else that I really like is he's got these small little finesse ones. And again, I like these because they have, again, closed eye. But it's kind of like the old beetle spin, except there's no like loose hinge that tends to pop open frequently on the beetle spin. Again, it's super effective. But these, because it's all one piece, I love putting a nice little paddle tail on there. And I'll flip this around just around the heavy cover on the edges, or like right into the back of the bulrushes as far as I can go, and just I'll kind of twitch this around and fish it more like a swim jig, kind of hopping it around in the bottom sometimes on the retrieve. But that's what I really like, is those finesse ones there. But he's still got a nice solid hook. So when I cast this on my medium heavy bass gear around the weeds, it's not my super heavy cover rod, but I don't have these hooks bend out either. Like they're a nice solid little hook, even though it's a small spinnerbait.
Yeah, and I've seen you catch some pretty big bass on that. just when like you have to downsize, right? So like sometimes, like we've always talked about, sometimes when the fish get, finicky, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to change what kind of lure you're using. It just may mean that you have to change the size of your lure. And especially like we said, when you're fishing pressure lakes, you may think like a lure like a spinnerbait, it's a pretty popular lure. Like how many times has someone fished a spinnerbait in front of this fish today? Especially if you're fishing one of the like busy lakes. It's like, okay, guys went through here, especially cottagers. Like spinnerbaits are just one of those lures that like a lot of people own, even people that aren't really obsessed with fishing. Maybe that fish has seen so many spinnerbaits on the weekend, but you just went through and chucked a tiny little one and it just buzzed by their head. They just may have that instinct to be like, oh, mine, grab it. Not like, oh, I've seen that 8 times today. I honestly think that fish probably, after they get caught by a bait a few times, especially if it's a very specific bait, like a spinnerbait, I think that they kind of recognize that that's a dangerous thing. You know what I mean? They'll be like, oh, I feel that vibration, that visual silhouette of that lure. And they kind of relate that to danger and they stay away from it. So even changing, like, we're going to get into this for like some cool tips, is like changing the blade or changing the size of the spinnerbait. But generally speaking, most fish are pretty dumb. So let's not overcomplicate this. One spinnerbait that I think Blackfly Lures is the most famous for are the hatchet blade spinnerbaits. Now these are awesome. You can't not have these in your tackle box. They are great. The blade itself, so it's a regular spinnerbait, but instead of the willow leaf blades or Colorado blades, he actually has these hatchet blades, which not many companies have. It's very rare to see other spinnerbaits with these. Now they have a very cool action in the water. It's very unique. And like I said, it has a different thump to it. They have a different way they spin in the water, different flash, different vibration, different everything. So if you are fishing in pressured water, try one of the hatchet blades. It's just different enough that it could make a difference for you. And we've done very well with these. This is actually one of my favorite colors. It's like a green pumpkin color. Who would have thought that green pumpkin would be one of Jesse's favorite? And I've got one more that is a must-have, and this is more of a newer one. I caught a really nice pike on this last year. This is his Hex series. Now the Hex series, it has a really sharp black nickel hook. This is a cool color. I forget what he calls this color. I was trying to look it up quick. Oh, it's called the Hex series Lightning. Now it's black and purple. And again, like I said, purple's the deal. And it's got really big blades that are kind of like, they have like a turtleback pattern on them. This has a very large blade compared to other spinnerbaits that he has. It has a lot of thump. It's a double willow leaf blade. So it's got 2 big willow leaf blades. So you can still retrieve it very fast, but it has a lot of flash and a lot of thump in the water. If you're looking to get some new spinnerbaits this year and you don't have anything in purple, I'd recommend it. It does pretty good, especially for pike and musky, I find. So those are some of his baits. And like we mentioned, the big musky ones, if you are an angler that likes to target those big toothy fish, I'd recommend these more for musky. Giant pike eat these too, 100%. But they are fantastic musky lures. Again, you can troll them, you can cast them. They work great. I've caught some good fish on them too. I thought we could just go quick through the giveaway and then we'll kind of talk about trailers to put on spinnerbaits because you want to have a trailer on that. So the giveaway, Dean is offering, or he's not offering, he's giving away generously $75. $75. That's a lot of spinnerbaits. You could buy quite a few of them. And yeah, so Dean was like, yeah, well, let's do $75 and we'll get some lucky person, a Patreon member, set up for bass season or musky or pike or walleye or whatever you want to catch, because spinnerbaits catch everything. He also has a bunch of other stuff on there. Trailer hooks, wire leaders, fluorocarbon leaders, anything you need to go bass fishing, pike fishing, musky fishing. Definitely, we'd like to thank Dean for that. We've been using Blackfly lures for years and years and years. And he's always been such a good support to our channel and our podcast. We had a really good giveaway with him last year. So we really appreciate him wanting to be, another sponsor on the show. That just shows you that it's worth it to these guys. They're getting sales from this. So we would appreciate it. Again, we're not affiliated with Blackfly Lures. Like, we don't get any money when you guys buy stuff. But if you do order something, write in the comments that AOA sent you, just so that he knows it's worth his time. So he'll do it again. And if he does it again, you have another chance to win some cool, gift cards and promo codes and stuff. So we'd like to thank him again for that. So let's go into trailers. Now, we're pretty I think that generally we probably overthink it. I would say that. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. When in doubt, go with a tandem axle. Oh, wrong trailers. I'm sorry. Yeah.
We
Overthinking.
Yeah.
Yes, that's definitely a thing I never do.
We probably overthink trailers. I know with chatterbaits, we're very particular. We went in depth about chatterbait trailers in our chatterbait episode last year. But with spinnerbaits, for me, there's not a lot of action the spinnerbait has itself. Like a chatterbait, when you're reeling that in and the blades whipping back and forth, the whole body is swaying like that. So you can use a pretty dead action trailer and it'll whip around because the body itself is moved by the blade. Now with the spinnerbait, that's not so much the case. There is some vibration from the blades, which kind of like, it's going to pulse the skirt a little bit. So you don't necessarily need a trailer. But if you want to add a trailer, one of the benefits is it will add some more action. It also adds weight to the spinnerbait. Spinnerbaits aren't the most aerodynamic baits to cast. So anytime you can add a little bit of weight to it, I'm going to do that because it'll help me cast a bit farther. So what's some of your favorite trailers, Andrew?
The most classic one that we've been using forever. I think it was the first trailer I ever put on a spinnerbait before, when I realized, hey, I can put plastic on this thing and make it better. It was it's like a 3.5 inch twister tail on a regular sized spinnerbait. And just to have that twister tail coming off the back and its ribbon tail is feathering out from behind that skirt. It just looks so much more enticing. And sometimes it can give a little, depending how big or how hard the plastic is, sometimes, like you said, it can kind of give a bit of a roll, a shimmy to that spinnerbait as you retrieve it in. So again, you're not only getting the flash, but you're altering the vibration a little bit because it's now moving through the water as it's coming along.
Yeah, I agree. One of my favorite trailers of all time is a 5-inch Berkeley or Mr. Twister grub. Even the double tail grubs can be fantastic. Actually, one really cool trailer, which I like mostly for pike fishing, is Mr. Twister makes a 6-inch twister tail. But the cool thing about it is it's a regular 3-inch body with a 4-inch long twister on it. So it's not really like your traditional, just like little, twister on the back. It's a long slithering one. So the action behind the bait is just like a weird thing. Now for bass, I probably wouldn't use that because you might get some short strikes, but with pike in general, I think they find it enticing. And they inhale the bait anyway, so I don't think it matters. But a twister is one of my favorites. I fish a lot of black spinnerbaits and a lot of white spinnerbaits. So I usually have 5-inch black, whatever brand grub you like, and then white. And then you can mix and match. I don't think it really matters. Sometimes contrast is good. So if you're fishing like, say, a black spinnerbait, put it like a hot orange or chartreuse trailer on it, and it can really like make that thing pop when you're reeling it through the water. So that's a great bait. Another classic bait that you can put on the back of a spinnerbait is just like a paddletail grub. Right here I have X-Zone Swammer 4-inch. Classic, yeah. It's got that little boot tail and it just gives it a little bit of kick as it's coming through the water. Again, it's going to add some more weight so you can cast it farther, but it also gives that little kick. For smallmouth, one of my favorite trailers, Pro Water Baits. This is probably my favorite trailer of all time for spinnerbaits. It's a Pro Water Baits minnow. It's a swim bait. The cool thing about this bait, I know I've talked about it before, and I'm talking about it again because I'm really, really into this trailer for spinnerbaits. It's not a traditional swim bait. It's similar size. I think it's like 4-inch, 3.5-inch long, but the body is regular, and then about halfway, it just gets super skinny. So the tail, the skinny part of the tail, it's very limp and wiggly. So it's not like a regular swim bait that is gonna, have a really thick wobble to it as it comes through the water. This tail pretty much just like swings back and forth. It's so whippy. Pretty sure these were designed to be like trailers. They just work so good for that. And again, that's the Pro Water Baits. These are, again, another local Ontario company. I did really good. I think I went through 2 or 3 packs last year of these. I was just fishing them for everything. And, they get bit. They have just enough action on the back just to be whippy in the back. And I find like sometimes a fish will follow your spinnerbait and maybe he's not interested. But if you got that little twister tail or the little paddle tail just, twitching and curling in the back there, sometimes that thing is just enough to make the fish strike. And I know musky guys have been doing that for decades, right? How many musky lures do you see that they don't try to stick some kind of a twister tail on the back hook? Like that's the thing. And even a big musky lure, they'll have just a little twister tail on the back sometimes. And just that little action makes a difference, they claim.
Another thing I really like too is something like, I don't know what you'd call it, like a small little like flipping bait almost, similar to what the Z-Man Goat would be, if you can picture that. So it has like 2 short tails, not like a craw trailer, but just like 2 little like shorter tails on it. And you split those and you rig it sideways on the spinnerbait and it'll come along and it just kind of kicks both legs sideways, like upright. And that's, something like that, like like a small little flipping bait like that, and it starts to kick the tails, you don't want something with huge claws coming off of it, but just a bit smaller appendages. And yeah, they kick, and it looks like a little like sunfish swimming in right behind, like underneath. It looks like a small school of minnows almost. Once you get like 4 blades and one of those swimming down below as a little target, it works really well.
Yeah, and this is the Wambaits Wambunctious, and it's basically just a double tail. It's I guess it's technically a grub, but it has like 2 little kicking tails in the back. And again, if you rig it this way, you'll get more lift. If you rig it vertically, it does look like a fin of a sunfish. And if you ever see a sunfish swim, even if it's just sitting there in the water, its tail kind of does this. You ever see a bass or a sunfish do that? And this kind of reminds me of that. And it's a lot of action, but it's not a lot of action that is pulling. It doesn't have a lot of like draw to it, so you can still reel the spinnerbait in pretty fast. That thing will just kick, if you reel in slow, it'll kick more. If you reel in fast, it'll just kind of kick slightly in the back. So those are cool. I'll link all these trailers down below if you want to take a look at them. Again, we're not affiliated with them, but if you do buy any of them, especially online, just be like, yo, the boys from AOA sent me. That's bait hacks from the streets, boys.
For real.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about some techniques. We kind of covered some of these, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth because these are techniques that work really good, that have worked really good for us, but I know that they will work good for you too. So one of them is called slow rolling. Now, slow rolling is a pretty cool technique. And again, it goes kind of like into what Andrew said about the versatility of a spinnerbait. We're going to talk about 3 techniques. One we kind of went into, which is helicoptering, but the other one is burning. And then the one we're going to talk about is slow rolling. So these techniques are kind of like fast, slow, not even moving. It's just like, it's so versatile, the spinnerbait. So we're talking about slow rolling first. Now, oftentimes, especially I use this technique for smallmouth, usually when you find an area where it's a little bit deeper. Now a spinnerbait, it has a lift. So when you reel it in, unlike a crankbait, when you reel a crankbait in, it dives deeper. When you reel a spinnerbait in, generally, the blades are creating lift and it goes up. So when you're doing slow rolling, it's basically letting your bait sink very deep and reeling it basically as slow as possible. So it's basically just slowly clacking along the bottom. That can be deadly for any species of fish, but especially smallmouth, because oftentimes smallmouth are in deeper water. Now, you need a very specific bait to do slow rolling correctly. You need a bait that has a bigger body. So if you're used to using 3/8 to 1/2 ounce spinnerbaits, you may bump up to a 3/4. You may bump up to a 1 ounce spinnerbait. And the one thing that I would say too is if you don't want to buy a new spinnerbait, you can make some modifications to your spinnerbaits to make them better for slow rolling. So get the heaviest spinnerbait you have, change out the blade. So if you have a big honkin' Colorado blade or willow leaf blade, try to put on the thinnest blade that you can get that'll help it get down deeper. Because like we said, blades create a lot of lift. Now, again, you don't want to go too thin because slow rolling involves keeping it deep and having a lot of thump at the bottom. But you don't want to have a bait that has just big honking blades because it will want to raise up. So that is one really cool technique. You can cast it out, make sure you let it sink all the way to the bottom. It may take a while if you're fishing in deep water because it's going to helicopter down, and then just reel. And the cool thing is you can watch your rod twitch as the blades are spinning. So you know the thing's working, and all of a sudden you'll just be reeling it, and all of a sudden it'll just feel like you just snag a rapidly sinking anchor. It just stops. And that means a big smallmouth or a big pike just came up and just grabbed it off the bottom. And it's fantastic. It's such a cool technique. I'm not a huge deep water angler. I grew up fishing a lot of shallow water. So whenever I get to fish deep water, especially for smallmouth, which is fantastic, they're so fun to catch, it's just very exciting for me. So have you ever done that, Andrew?
I used to do it. It wasn't like super deep water, but I found like on rocks and stuff like that. Again, we've mentioned it so many times, but because of that arm, when you're reeling it in and it's dragging bottom on the bottom of that bait, that wire can help kind of lift it up over top of some of the obstacles it's going to come across. So it's really effective for the bottom. And like you said, what I've done is I'll kind of rob from other spinnerbaits.
Yeah, that's what I do.
So the backside of the one blade here, the largest blade is usually the one on the very end. And so, for instance, in the Blackfly spinnerbaits, he's got it on a split ring. So you can just take the blade off that split ring and then take one of the other blades from another spinnerbait that you have sitting there. It has a smaller willow leaf blade and put that in the back. Like Jesse said, that'll help make it run even deeper. Or you can even pick up loose blades at, different tackle shops and whatnot, and just make them that way. I was really interested because I saw it on a fishing show. I think it was like Real Fishing back in the day. It was, slow rolling a spinnerbait along like this sand flat. And they showed some underwater footage of the thing. I'm like, that just looks so cool. Because the blades stay upright and out of that kind of muck, and they're just flashing right above this object, this other creature, just like scuttling along the bottom, filter feeding the bottom or something, right? That's what it kind of looks like as it's stirring up the sediment. So it's a super effective way to fish a spinnerbait, and will present any bait.
Yeah. We kind of like talk about fishing deep, and slow rolling may be slightly different. So slow rolling is fishing a bait very slow along the bottom. If you're using smaller blades to get down deep, you can still fish them fast. So there's two different techniques there that we're talking about, but both of them are effective. So we did talk a little bit about helicoptering. We're not going to really go much into that, but basically you're casting. You can helicopter a bait in 4 feet of water. You can do it in deeper water too. But one cool way is when you're fishing largemouth, you're fishing around, weeds. And maybe the weeds only come up 4 feet and you're in 6 feet of water. So you're reeling your spinnerbait over the weeds, but then all of a sudden you see this like deep hole. You reel it in, and then as soon as you get over that hole, you just stop reeling and you let that thing flutter down into the hole, and then you jerk it up and keep reeling. That fluttering down is going to attract any bass there. And when you rip it up to start reeling again, reaction bite. Boom! Largemouth smacks it. That can be especially effective too, I find, for musky and pike.
And you might think, oh, I'm stopping reeling, it's going to stop all the action of the bait. But because it has that weight on the bottom, I'll just show on the small one here, as it sinks down, that blade above it, you're not pulling it forward, which is causing the blade to spin, but that blade just starts lifting up, and the weight of it comes down, and the blade is now spinning on top. It's just a vertical presentation. The blade still has all the movement it needs to continue spinning and fluttering as it comes down. So it's not impeding any action. It's just all of a sudden changing it up. And then you can get that reaction strike.
Definitely. And oftentimes with search baits or baits that are, cast and retrieve, sometimes it only takes changing the speed or direction of the bait to trigger a strike. Fish, we've seen it. We saw it this past weekend when we were fishing. Fish will follow your bait, just staring at it, and until you literally twitch your bait quick or move the bait to the side, they won't touch it. And then
how many times have you had a fish that has followed your bait all the way to your boat, and then as soon as you lift it out of the water, all of a sudden it moved up, and what happens? Oh, a fish jumps out after it, and you're like, oh, I missed a fish. It was right there. I should have been paying attention. It happens a lot. I'm sure everyone who's listening, it's probably happened to you at least once.
It probably happened to you last weekend.
Yeah. What happened was your bait came across horizontally, and then you're done your reeling, and you just lift it up, and it came up. Oh, all of a sudden it's different, and that fish is like, I need to get it before it gets away.
Yeah. Look at using a figure 8 for musky fishing. And if you're not familiar with that is, when you reel in your bait in a straight line pretty much, and when it gets towards the boat, you put your rod in the water and you do a big 8 in the water, or even an oval. And that change in direction is what causes these musky to trigger, because they're really known for just following baits in. They'll follow.
And a lot of the time they'll hit on
40,
50
50 feet.
That first corner. He'll go and I'm going to start the figure 8, and boom. That's when they try their first strike at it.
Yeah. So helicoptering, it is something that it is different. And when you change the speed of the bait, when you're just reeling it in, all of a sudden you just let it flutter down, that can trigger a strike. Or when you start ripping it up again, that can trigger a strike. So that's fantastic. So the last technique we're going to talk about is burning a spinnerbait. I think mostly it's a smallmouth technique, but you could probably catch mostly anything on it, any predatory fish. But
pike are quick, and they'll nail those things too. Now, again, if you're burning it in, it's going to be riding higher, and pike have poor aim on top water, notoriously.
Yeah,
but they will go for it.
Yeah. So burning a spinnerbait is exactly what it sounds. You cast that thing. It's a search technique. You're going to whip that thing as far as you can whip it, and then you're going to reel it as fast as you can turn the handle. And don't for a second think that you're going to reel in too fast and the fish won't be able to catch it. There's no predatory fish in Ontario that can't catch your bait at the full speed. Pike, musky, bass, they can swim fast.
Yeah. And there's a key thing. It's called bulging. And it's kind of the fastest you kind of want to burn it. You can't go faster and fish will hit kind of whatever sometimes. But one of the best ways to burn it in is as you're ripping it in along that surface, you don't want the blades to come out of the water, because then they stop spinning and they'll just kind of glide across the top. It'll turn sideways. It can be effective if you want to bring it across the top of lily pads or something like that. You can do that. But if you have open water or you're fishing above the weed and there's no surface weeds, you bulge it, it's called. And so you're bringing it in as high and as fast as possible. And it actually creating like a bulge and a wake right at the top of that blade spinning. And it's, coming kind of above the water's edge, but the water's just kind of bulging around it. And that's your ideal speed. If you want to kind of figure out how high is it, as high as you possibly can without it breaking the water surface.
Yeah. And smallmouth especially love that. They love chasing. Largemouth, not so much. They don't really they're lazy. They don't like chasing stuff. But smallmouth, they love it.
If pike don't come in from the bottom, if they come in from behind, they'll often nail that. And one of the most exciting things is you're used to casting out, ripping it, and you see that wake. And then that one time you're looking and you're like, am I doing something different? Because it seems to have like 2 wakes and I don't understand. And all of a sudden, boom, like it's a huge strike. It's exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Smallmouth, like I said, they love chasing. They love really fast presentation, especially in the summer when their metabolism is super high and they're just crazy. Like Andrew has seen me catch smallmouth on jerkbaits and I'm jerking so fast, like jerk, 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 jerk. And all of a sudden the smallmouth will come out of nowhere and just smack it. They are just crazily attracted to fast moving erratic baits, and burning a spinnerbait is one of those techniques. Now, you need a specific spinnerbait to burn effectively. You can use any spinnerbait, but you're not going to want to use something with Colorado blades, obviously, because Colorado blades are the more round ones. They throw off a lot of thump and vibration, but they're not good at high speed. You're going to want thin willow leaf blades. Thin ones, they have these blades called burner blades. They're very thin. They basically have not a lot of resistance, so you can reel them in really fast. So that's a cool technique. Try it this summer if you're ever in an area around rocks or on weed edges and stuff. Cast a spinnerbait out, and if the fish are chewing and like you're catching quite a bit of fish, save yourself some time and just start burning it in as fast as you can. You'd be surprised some of these fish will come out of nowhere, and the strikes are arm jarring because you're already reeling it in fast. This bait's coming in like 4 feet a minute or a second, 4 feet a second, just, and all of a sudden it just boom, bass comes up and smacks it. And musky too are another fish that love fast retrieves, especially in the summertime. You see those guys fishing musky like bucktails and spinnerbaits, and they're reeling them in so fast. Like Andrew said, it's bulging under the surface, like burning blades they call it, and it's just coming in fast. And these, I think what it does is it makes the fish have to react at a split second. So they have to decide. They probably feel this bait coming like many feet away. And then it goes over top of them and they have to decide in that split second, do I eat that thing or do I let it go away? And I think sometimes it's just that reaction that they're like, oh, and they have to grab it.
It's like their one shot, once in a lifetime.
Would you take it? Oh, man, I'm hungry for mom's spaghetti right now. So I thought we could go into a little bit about Blackfly lures. Again, we're huge fans of Blackfly lures. They're made in Ontario, classic bait in Ontario. They catch fish like crazy. We've had good success. Again, Andrew's one of his biggest muskies ever was caught on a Blackfly lures. I've caught so many bass and walleye on these things too. So what makes Blackfly lures unique, Andrew? I know you already mentioned it earlier, but I thought we could go a little bit more in depth about it.
So the biggest thing for me with any spinnerbait, with any framed bait like that, is his closed eye. So all of them, they all have a closed eyelet. Some of them you'll have, I have an example here. You'll have a blade and it just comes up and that's the R frame, right? It looks like an R, but it's open. So as soon as you use a leader, like if I'm going for pike, I'm going to want one. And as soon as you put a leader on, that swivel or anything like that, it'll just start sliding around. And most of the time it'll slide up into your blades and it starts retrieving like this. And it just looks disgusting. But as soon as you enclose the eye, then you can use a snap. You can use whatever you want. It doesn't have to be tied directly to your main line. So it's nice for changing out your baits, changing different weight, changing whatever you want. And then it's every time you cast, it's always going to be connected at the right spot. That's, for me, the biggest thing on where I really like his stuff, because all of his spinnerbaits have a closed eye. It's from the tiny ones to large ones.
And again, if you could argue like, you can put a piece of silicone tubing over the R-band to make it closed off. Mm-hmm. I've done that with other blades. They end up always breaking and I lose them and they fall off and then I'm annoyed because I don't have them. So I'd rather just have a bait that has a looped off eye. So I don't have to worry about that, because especially when you're pike fishing or musky fishing and you're using a leader with a snap on it, you want that eye to be closed, because otherwise you will be frustrated as heck every time you reel in. You're like, why does my bait feel weird when I'm reeling it in? And it's coming in sideways through the water. It's like, oh, the stupid snap went up to the blades again. Another thing that makes Blackfly lures really good, in my opinion, is he wire ties all of his skirts, which is amazing. So oftentimes you'll buy a spinnerbait and the skirt is just held on with an elastic band. Now, generally, that's not bad. I've caught tons of fish on spinnerbaits with regular bands, but eventually, especially if you go pike fishing, Andrew remembers last year I was using a white spinnerbait and I whipped it out. I hooked a pike on it, and then the pike threw the spinnerbait, and I reeled in the spinnerbait, and the skirt was completely gone. And the elastic just had a big tooth mark in it, and the whole skirt had like floated down in the lake. And we motored up to I felt bad leaving it in the water. So we motored up to it and we like scooped it up with the net. And the whole skirt just ripped. It was the first cast with the spinnerbait, or the first few casts, and the skirt just completely ripped off. And I was like, well, that's trash. So the fact that Blackfly lures, he actually wire ties the skirts on. The skirts on these spinnerbaits, you don't have to worry about. I have Blackfly lure spinnerbaits. Like, remember this old one I was telling you about that we've caught a bunch of pike and musky on? Like, this thing is trashed. Like, it's all completely trashed. The head's loose now. It's been hit against docks, everything. It's just trashed. And the skirt is still completely fine. Like, it's ratted up, but it's not coming off there. It's tied on with wire. So
I've got a bunch of pike and bass in this one. And yeah, like the hook keeper, the bait keeper is all getting torn up. I've sharpened the hook a bunch of times. Even the head, like, it's got some nasty wear on it, but yeah, that skirt is still on.
Yeah. And that's great. Cause like when you buy lures with your hard-earned money, you don't want to have to worry about replacing them anytime soon. So some of these lures that we have, the blades are chipped, the head's chipped, the head's loose, the hook has to be sharpened, but the skirt is still fine. And you can sharpen the hook, and fish don't care if there's some chips on the head or on the blade. They will still catch fish for you. So they're good quality baits. They're made in Ontario. Again, up for grabs for our giveaway is a $75 promo code to blackflylures.ca. And the winner of that is going to be announced on our Patreon. And you have to be a Patreon member to enter these giveaways. Now, if you are a Patreon member, you are one of the cool people that donates a few bucks every month to help run this show. This show has some expenses. It does, yeah. You Patreon members, you help support the show so that me and Andrew don't have to pay for this weekly show out of our own pocket. So in our appreciation, we get up a bunch of giveaways every month so that you have a chance of winning some really cool giveaways. We actually had a whole bunch of really good ones this spring already. Summer coming up, we have a bunch of more for you guys too. So if you like the show and you love watching every single episode, consider becoming a Patreon member because it helps us out, but it also could possibly help you get more lures. We're going to go into a special tips section, which is going to be super quick. Ooh. Andrew doesn't even know about it. It's so secret. So the secret tips for spinnerbaits is this. Andrew kind of mentioned it before. I'm kind of disappointed. But one thing that I really like to do, and I know some guys do this that are absolute hammers, that's why I started doing it, is buy a bunch of blades in different colors and sizes. Now, you don't have to have a lot of spinnerbaits. Just have extra blades. So one of my favorite colors of blades when I'm pike fishing is I like a white spinnerbait with chartreuse blades. Now that on a cloudy day is lights out. Love it. But all of a sudden the sun comes out and you're like, okay, I need a spinnerbait now with shiny blades, like silver blades. Or maybe it's cloudy out and you're like, oh, I want to have gold blades. Have a bunch of different blades. Have some Colorados. If you're fishing at night, a Colorado blade has so much thump. If you have a bunch of different blades and you can experiment, you can easily, it takes literally 2 seconds to switch a blade off on the split ring on a spinnerbait. I know Blackfly Lures, he has his on really nice ball bearing swivels on some of them. And you just like, there's a big split ring. You take the blade off in like 2 seconds, put another one on, change the size of the blade, make the blade bigger. It'll fish shallower. Make the blade smaller. You can reel it in faster or it'll go deeper. So with that tip, you can really change a lot about a spinnerbait and how it fishes in literally like 5 seconds when you just change the blade. You don't have to have like 50 spinnerbaits. I mean, Dean at Blackfly Lures would love if you bought 50 spinnerbaits, but you don't need that. I'll tell you, this isn't a sponsored ad. You don't need that many, but have a few different colors. And then if you pick up old, like what Andrew said, one thing that I do is every time a spinnerbait eventually dies, I always cut the blades off. I keep the blades and I have a whole box of blades and I'll be like, oh, this is a cool blade. I'll put that on this. I'll change this around. A lot of these spinnerbaits that I showed you today, they don't have the original blades on them. I swap them out all the time because it really can make a difference sometimes just having a painted blade or having a bright silver blade, or even like Andrew said, a hammered blade has a lot of flash too. So different blades.
And a little extra bonus for Jesse's tip there. If you get some small snap ball bearing swivels and they have little snaps on it, you can put the swivel on the arm of the spinnerbait, and then instead of a split ring, it's even easier to have a little snap. You undo it, you can change your blade, snap it back together. it's even easier to change out those blades.
Yeah, just make sure it's a good one, or else it'll just snap open and your blade will disappear forever. One last tip I would say is make sure, depending on what you're fishing for, make sure you have a trailer hook available. Now, we don't always use trailer hooks because sometimes a trailer hook will actually do more. It'll be more annoying than anything. So like this spinnerbait, I'm fishing in open water. This is the Blackfly Lures quad blade, has 4 blades. This is an open water bait for me. I'm trying to cover water fast. The blades are skinny so I can retrieve it fast, lots of flash. So I have a trailer hook on it. He sells them on his website too. So when sometimes smallmouth will just swat at a bait. So when you have a trailer hook that's sticking back a little bit further, you'll hook a lot more fish. If I'm fishing in heavy cover, a trailer hook oftentimes will pick up weeds and sticks and it'll snag a lot more. So I do recommend using a trailer hook, but it may be situational for where or what you're fishing for. One thing, again, I will use trailer hooks a lot for musky fishing, unless I'm fishing around like heavy cover. Just like I got this big, massive lures down here. Like, it's all stuck together. But again, I always have a trailer hook on my musky baits if I can get away with it, because if I can get a musky to finally smack my bait, I want all odds in my favor of that fish actually getting stuck. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, going a little more in depth. We couldn't cover all the tips of all times on spinnerbaits, but those are some of the tips and techniques that have been effective for us in our area. And I'm sure that they're effective all around Ontario as well as North America as well. That's how much coverage we have. All of North America. Just kidding. Just Ontario. These spinnerbaits will not work anywhere else. Just kidding.
I don't know, we're used up all our time, but one last thing I just wanted to mention is if you can pick yourself up a spinnerbait box, like specifically for spinnerbaits, you can, cut notches into your regular 360 to 370 boxes that can kind of fit in across 2 lengths of the tray. But it's these things I picked up. This one's actually from Blackfly Lures. They are so nice. So just if you're not using them because you haven't taken, if they don't fit right in your tackle box because they have this big frame on them, find a way to bring some with you, even if you're in a baggie on the side pocket or something. Have some with you because they are very versatile baits and they can definitely get more fish in your hand landed if you are making use of them in your best situations.
Definitely. So we'd like to thank everyone again for listening to this episode. Again, we're getting a lot of really good interaction and reviews on this podcast. So we do like to thank everyone that has left us a review. We really appreciate it. We read every single review. We really, really appreciate it. Our ratings on Spotify and Apple, our star ratings, they're going up. Pretty impressive. But if you haven't rated us yet, take a second, do us a huge favor. We really appreciate when you do that. It helps us rank higher on the charts and helps us get bigger sponsors too. So we do thank that. So before we end this episode, we have the quote of the week. And to handle that, we have the man with the mustache and the beard, Andrew.
If you're sick of the black flies biting you, make those fish bite a black fly lure.